Gather round, my friends. I'd like to tell you a story from my radio days. For 3 years back in the days before the World Wide Web, all the way back in the late 1980s, in fact, I hosted a locally produced radio show on Sunday nights called A Night at the Asylum. 2 hours of comedy songs, routines, and sketches that heavily borrowed its format from the nationally syndicated Dr. Demento show. I realized that the name for the show, A Night at the Asylum, wouldn't fly these days without raising more than a few objections. Believe me, I know that mental health is a serious issue for millions of people, but humor has long had an association with looking at things from a weird perspective, and terms like crazy or mad or lunacy were just as often associated with being off-kilter as they were with being neurodivergent. To the extent that most humor springs from incongruity, the fact that the show was named after an old, abandoned, and unpleasant local landmark was intended to be deliberately incongruous. I'm not going to apologize for the way the English language has evolved, but I'll concede that if I were to start such a show today, I would likely choose a different name. Maybe A Night Under Your Favorite Street Lamp? No! Okay. How about An Evening of Amusements Before Bed? That's a pretty lame way to refer to comedy, but at least it's not offensive. And that's the most important part, right? To not offend anyone? Ever? Right? Welcome to the INRIS Files, presenting thoughts on culture, history, and the human condition from a very specific Generation X point of view. Okay, it would be super easy to get on my soapbox about how everybody gets offended by everything these days. And yeah, Grandpa, stop shaking your fist at the sky and telling us to get off your lawn. I know what you're thinking. What's a soapbox? Never mind. The fact is, when I hosted this radio show, I was much younger than I am now, and times were different too. Some stuff I played then I would not play now, simply because our society has changed. One popular song on our show back then was Julie Brown's The Homecoming Queen's Got a Gun. School shootings weren't a thing back then, and the idea that a homecoming queen would interrupt the homecoming parade with a murderous rampage was so incongruous you couldn't help but laugh at the idea. But today in the 2020s, it would have a different ring to it. And there are artists I wouldn't play now either if I were hosting that show today. In the late 1980s, you could never go wrong with a stand-up routine by Bill Cosby. He was the absolute master at telling stories about the most mundane things, like going to the dentist or serving breakfast to your kids, and make them the funniest things you've ever heard. But we've learned since then that in real life, the guy was a monster, an absolute bona fide monster. Now, if I were hosting my comedy radio show these days, you wouldn't hear me play Bill Cosby any more than you'd see me host an event screening a movie starring O.J. Simpson. And as much as I like to stir up controversy, I don't suppose I'd be playing any routines by Roseanne Barr or Louis C.K. these days either. If you don't recognize any of these names, look them up sometime. Performers of note who are problematic for one reason or another. We can talk another day about separating the art from the artist, and that really is an important discussion. But for now, let's just say that a 2-hour show that's supposed to make you laugh a time or two might not be the time or place to put these routines back on the airwaves. This kind of self-censorship, in the interest of being sensitive to the general audience, isn't a new idea. When I hosted this show in the late 1980s, I'd frequently play a routine by Stan Freberg called Elderly Man River, which was all about changing the lyrics to a popular song so as not to offend one group or another, and that routine was first broadcast in the 1950s. And yes, kids, that was before I was born. I'm old, but I'm not that old. But even having said all that, there were things I played back then that I likely would play today. Then as now, they were not everybody's cup of tea. I have lots of stories to tell about my radio days, but for now I'm just going to tell you about one particular show. The theme for that night's show was death. Now, death is one of those universal topics like sex or drugs or flying on airplanes or hating your job that everybody can relate to. That's why it's a topic that comes up again and again in humor. Why the punchline of Shakespeare's funniest and most famous comedy, Hamlet, involves every character dying by the end. Brilliant stuff. And because death is such a popular subject for comedians, I had plenty of material from which to choose. I did a few sets that evening regarding the theme. A set would be 4 or so songs, routines, or sketches that are all related. I played a set early on about murder and mayhem, which included the song I mentioned earlier, The Homecoming Queen's Got a Gun, as well as Mel Brooks's brutal satire, Springtime for Hitler. I'm pretty sure I put together a set on diseases and medical mishaps, and another set speculating on the afterlife with bits like Heaven is for Presbyterians. And at some point about halfway into the show, I played a set about dead animals. Yes, I know. But really, there's a lot of incongruity to be mined in a song that points out that dead puppies aren't much fun, or laments the unpleasantness of driving by a dead skunk in the middle of the road. This was the set that started the phone ringing. A caller phoned the DJ line to tell me that it was in terrible taste to play songs about dead animals, and fair enough. Our show wasn't about humor and good taste. It was about humor that tastes good. That's a reference to a commercial that only Gen Xers will recognize. Sorry about that, kids. But I asked the guy, what did he think about the bits I'd played earlier, like Springtime for Hitler? Oh yeah, that was really funny. I like that. You should do more like that. So, okay, the Holocaust is a fine source of humor, but I'm looking over my dead dog Rover is off limits. Got it. But then I got a call that hit me like a freight train. The caller was a senior at one of the local colleges, and he was phoning to tell me that his girlfriend had terminal cancer. It felt like my stomach took an express elevator down and I was in free fall. I was dreading what he might say next. But what he said was this. They had been listening to our show for a couple of years at this point, tuning in every Sunday night while finishing up their homework for the following day, and that after her diagnosis, it was the one source of comfort they could always rely upon. He said they both thanked us for helping them laugh. Even tonight, I asked? Yes. They thought this was one of the best shows, making fun of death. It was a humbling experience, and even now, over 30 years later, relating the story makes me feel that connection all over again. I was talking earlier today with a group of folks online, and one of the guys mentioned that he was worried that if he spoke about the things that mattered to him, he might win over some people, but he also might lose a few people. It reminded me of this little episode from when I was on the radio. By playing the comedy that appealed to me, teasing topics that can affect people in different ways, I'm sure I lost some listeners, but that one night, I learned that I also gained some listeners and had even developed a profound kind of connection with them. There's a lot to be said for being sensitive to other people's feelings when you talk, or write, or even sing to the people in your orbit. There's a lot to be said for, whenever possible, not being a jerk. But there's also a lot to be said for being yourself, for being authentic. If you are true to yourself when you interact with others, you're going to turn some people off. You will lose some people. But you're also going to forge a much stronger connection with the people you bring in. What do you think? Do you tend to tell people what they want to hear, or do you share the things that you feel are worth sharing and keep the rest to yourself? I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments section below, and please be kind when you engage in the conversation. Be sure to click like if you want to see more videos like this, and subscribe if you'd like to be alerted about them when I post. Thank you for checking out the INRIS Files, and we'll see you again next time.